Madam Chair, Excellencies, Grand Chiefs and Chiefs, distinguished delegates, colleagues, Indigenous friends from around the world. Welcome to the United Nations. Welcome to our 17th Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. We have a lot of ground to cover and a lot of issues to discuss. And to start us off, I want to make 4 points this morning. The first is on people. The very first words of the United Nations Charter say, "We, the people." So this organization is of and for people. But we have not always seen this in our work. Too often, our meetings and events here have represented only certain types of people: diplomats, ministers, dignitaries, UN officials. This, at times, prevented us from getting a reality check from the ground, and it has allowed some of our activities to become too far removed from the experiences of people around the world. But this is changing, and we do not have to look further than this hall today to see that. The United Nations is doing more. It is engaging people outside of this building, including indigenous people. And I'm proud to say that many of these efforts began here, inside this very hall. 11 years ago, the General Assembly put indigenous issues firmly on the international agenda. It adopted the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of the World's Indigenous Peoples. Then, it set about turning declarations into actions. In 2014, the Assembly gathered for the first World Conference on Indigenous People. This was a big step, but the discussions confirmed that we had a long way to go, not only in our work to realize the rights of indigenous communities on the ground, but also in building stronger partnerships between indigenous peoples and the United Nations. And last year, the Assembly took another step. After 2 years of discussion, it decided to create a new space for interactive hearings. These hearings should find ways to break down the barriers to the participation of indigenous peoples in the work of the United Nations. I'm honored to be presiding over the first one tomorrow, and I encourage you all to come with concrete ideas and proposals. But today, as we open this forum, let us not forget, the United Nations is here for people, and that includes indigenous people. The steps taken by the General Assembly so far have had good results, but we cannot yet say that this organization has opened its doors wide enough, and so we need to be more ambitious. As my second point, however, I want to issue a warning. We cannot let recent progress hide the facts on the ground. These facts are bleak, but they need to be seen and heard by all of us here. There are 370 million indigenous people in the world today. They make up just 5% of the world's population. But when we take poverty into account, we see a spike in the figures, because indigenous people amount to 15% of the world's poorest people, according to the World Bank. That's shocking. And poverty is not the only challenge they face. Their human rights are being violated. They do not always have access to decent housing and schools. They are being excluded and marginalized from the systems that should protect them. They are facing violence and even death just for asserting their basic rights. And they are losing the lands and resources they depend on for survival. Which brings me to my third point on the theme of this year's forum. We are here to focus on indigenous land, territories, and resources. And so we should, because they are being taken away. Indigenous people are being dispossessed. They are losing the lands their ancestors called home. But even when they can hold onto their own territories, it is still not plain sailing. Their land and its resources are being degraded around them. Sometimes this is because of human activity. Other times it's caused by the climate change. In March, I convened a high-level event on water. During it, we heard from Autumn Peltier, a 13-year-old water activist from the Wik-Wimikong First Nations. She spoke about the crucial role the water plays in her community. And she told us about her fears that this water will dry up or become too polluted to drink. So she made a call to action, and I want to echo it today. She said, "We cannot just pray anymore. We must do something, and we need to do it now. We can no longer talk about indigenous lands as if they are like any others. We need to better understand their significance for the communities they belong to. They represent livelihoods, spirituality, family, and indeed, survival. So I'm glad we are focusing on this issue for the 17th Forum. As my final point, I want to look ahead. The signs do look positive. The United Nations has been doing more to open its doors to indigenous people, and it does not end there. On the ground, the United Nations teams are developing stronger partnerships. I saw this myself when I traveled to Colombia last month. In the western town of Totoro, I visited indigenous communities. I saw how closely they are working with various United Nations agencies, and I saw how determined they are to make their communities stronger and to ensure that the peace agreement sticks. Other encouraging signs are being seen at national level. In recent years, many states have deepened their engagement with indigenous peoples. New laws and policies have been adopted, and these are helping to protect and promote the rights of indigenous peoples. Some countries are even recognizing indigenous institutions. This means that the bodies and people chosen to represent indigenous communities can better interact with national policymakers. I'm sure we will hear many of the best practices during the forum. So we should be hopeful, but we cannot ignore the very real and very serious challenges. They cast a shadow over the future of many indigenous communities, and they demand our urgent attention. Excellencies, dear friends, our resolutions and our speeches can make it seem like everything is perfect. They emphasize the rights of indigenous peoples. They recognize the value of indigenous culture and heritage, and they encourage greater interaction and integration and participation of indigenous peoples in the decisions that affect them. But everything is not perfect. The reality for indigenous peoples is very different to how it sounds on paper. None of our resolutions talk about their desperations. None of our speeches can give credit to their pain. They deserve more than just our words. Words cannot protect their ancestral lands. Words cannot keep their lakes clean. And words cannot make sure there is a future ahead for their children. And so I hope we can have a permanent forum which goes beyond words, and a permanent forum which focuses not on politics or positions, but on people. Thank you.